questions that we're going to be taking in Zoom. So if you're watching this in Zoom, you can leave questions in the Q&A there. And we're also streaming this live at our YouTube channel at levernews.com. And we'll be trying to take questions throughout. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll do some more questions as we have time to do that. So let's bring in our guests. First off, Tony Carrk from Accountable US. So Tony, Accountable is a really great organization. I always follow your newsletter. You are a watchdog group that tracks special interests in Washington, and you have a lot of great information on your website put together by your researchers. The Trump Accountability War Room has a lot of up-to-date information about everything that's going on. And so thank you for joining us. And a friend of Accountable, Bharat Ramamurti. Hey there, Bharat. He is the senior advisor for the American Economic Liberties Project and the former director of the National Economic Council in the Biden administration, focusing on economic policy, financial regulation. And Bharat, I also saw that you were an economic advisor to Elizabeth Warren and part of her 2020 campaign. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Bharat and Tony, we are really happy that you can help us and our audience tie together everything that's been happening in the last 5 weeks since Trump's inauguration, because there's been so many things, so much news between what's happening with DOGE and the kind of slash and burn that Elon Musk is undertaking at the different federal agencies. And then on top of it, there's this tax bill and budget bill around these major initiative that Trump wants to do in his first 100 days, which is to both cut taxes and cut spending and keep it, not increase the deficit. Can either one of you just help us understand where are we at within this tax and budget bill? Because I think it's important to kind of anchor us in how this is all playing out right now. For example, I know that the House just passed its budget resolution on top of the Senate. What was in both of those bills and what happens next with that?
Well, I know Bharat will have a lot that he can add here, but I just want to say, I know it's been chaotic. I know that they've been trying to do a shock and awe of trying to do everything everywhere all at once, but we should remember what the fundamental tenet is of the Trump administration so far. It is to betray the voters that seemingly they were reaching out to over the course of the election, and who said that prices were too high, that they didn't think that the economy was working for them, and that they were making promises that they were going to help them. They're betraying that, and they've been pursuing an agenda that is for corporations, for their billionaire donors, and for their friends. So it's everything that they're doing is all to give more to the friends, billionaire donors, and corporations. Meanwhile, everyday working people are getting fewer protections, like the oversight committees, the oversight agencies that are supposed to protect consumers, like they're being gutted. And they're just pursuing an agenda where corporations are first and working people are last. But Bharat, I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit more specifically, like how anything else there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just focus on the magnitudes here, because as you said, I worked in the Biden administration and we had some priorities that we really wanted to pass. So I think about one of them was free community college. So everybody in the United States gets to go to community college for free, no cost, no tuition. The approximate cost of that proposal was $100 billion. So it cost $100 billion in public money over a 10-year period.
Yeah.
Okay. To do that, people raised a big fuss about it, said it was too expensive. We couldn't do it. Okay. This bill calls for $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. Okay. So 45 times the cost of that free community college proposal. And about 2.5 trillion of that 4.5 trillion in tax cuts goes to people in the top 2% of households in the United States. Okay. And so it is a massively expensive bill where the benefits are extraordinarily slanted towards the very, very richest households in the United States. And the way that they are talking about offsetting part of the cost of this, not the full cost, part of the cost, is by taking a hammer to Medicaid, right? Which is a program that, as folks know, provides insurance to low-income families, basically, and to people with disabilities. And so I said this on X, or Twitter, as I still call it, earlier today or yesterday. It is basically a bill designed in a lab to be as regressive and as unpopular as possible. Okay, because the other thing that people have to realize is that in 2017, they might remember Donald Trump passed a tax bill, and that was wildly unpopular and also very slanted towards the rich. Some of it was a big corporate tax cut. They cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That was done permanently, so it never expired. But they also included a bunch of tax cuts for largely for rich people, which are now expiring. And what
They
they're
would
trying to do
expire
is
at the
extend
end
them.
of the year
Exactly.
unless they pass this.
Right. So the thing to remember is that they're going to extend these tax cuts, which means that for most people, they're not going to see any change in their tax policy. Now, in other words, if you're a middle-class family, all this will do is keep your tax rate the same as it was before. But it means that that low-income families and folks who rely on the Medicaid program are going to see huge cuts to the benefits that they rely on. And it's going to be really damaging not only for their financial health, but for their actual physical health, given the fact that people rely on Medicaid to get preventative care, to get care when they're sick. And we've seen time after time that when you cut Medicaid, people's health suffers. I don't think it's exaggeration to say that more people will get sick and die because of these cuts.
And we do want to go more in depth into the tax cuts a little bit later on, but just to kind of define where that bill is at in the process, the way I understand it is like the House made its resolution, Senate has its resolution. Now they have to go and reconcile the two and really get into the details about where specifically this money is going to come from, because to your point, $4.5 trillion has to come from somewhere. And, the funny thing, the only Republicans that voted against either one of these resolutions, their big complaint wasn't the cuts, it was how this was going to increase the deficit. So their point was that the cuts need to go deeper if they want to get it. Nothing about the actual, tax breaks or the tax cuts that were, decreasing revenue and causing these big deficits to occur. But should we talk about DOGE? Let's talk about DOGE. I've actually heard people referring to it as doggy. So, maybe there's some other ways to say this acronym. If anyone in the chat has their preferred way of saying Doge,
I think it's wonderful to let Dogecoin, its inspiration, die. But I've heard it Doge officially.
You've heard it Doge officially. I've actually called it Dougie or Doogie.
For sure.
Doogie's a great one. But let's go into Doge. I want to step back a little bit and kind of put this in the framework of when Trump's first term, in his first 100 days, we all remember that was way back in 2017. And, we had the similar experience of chaos, a lot of so many things happening, the fire hose effect. The thing that's different about this time around is the introduction of Elon Musk as a character, as a major character in this administration. Bharat or Tony, did you see that coming? I mean, I think it was like Trump won the election and we all knew a lot of what was coming. But for me, the role that Elon Musk has taken on, I did not foresee that. That is something truly new.
I think that at the beginning of the campaign, I don't think I would have seen this, but as he was attending like pretty much every rally, and he donated what was it, $250 million to the Trump campaign. So to see this part, I'm not terribly surprised. I do think what this means is just a way of like, just take it, like, let's just break everything. I think that was like part of what the first Trump administration was like, let's try to break everything. They're doing it a little bit more in the second Trump administration. I think what DOGE in and of itself is like trying to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in government, which I think we all agree that there's areas where there's, inefficient spending. But I think they're using that as a mask to really gut the core tenets of what the government could do, but not only just about government, about the people it serves. Like, we're seeing the impacts to veterans. We're seeing, like, for example, I'm just even looking at headlines from today about Social Security offices being shuttered, in places like Nevada or Michigan, where people are, getting their payments processed. Looking at childhood, cancer research and other functions that I think people are like, that's not what I meant. But they're like, let's, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, the secretary put out a plan about like how they're going to lower the price of eggs, because clearly that is obviously a pain point for folks. But at the same time, they need to rehire a lot of people in the food safety, department, because they went and fired everybody. And it's like, how are you going to do that in the midst of like the bird flu and things that are causing the egg prices to go? So there's a lot of, I know they're saying like, we'll make some mistakes, like, oops, we shut down Ebola prevention for a little bit. But this isn't just about government and like their checks and balances, and that's very important about how they're trying to consolidate power. But it's like, this is causing actual harm to people, and I think that is what you're seeing more and more. Like coverage, I think you're seeing that in town halls across the country where people are saying this is directly impacting me, and we don't like this.
And Bharat, as you've observed the last 5 or 6 weeks of DOGE doing its work, what are some of the things that you've been most concerned about? A lot of it's concerning, but what to you really sticks out?
Yeah, it is completely haphazard and based on almost no knowledge about how the government works. Is really the thing that comes through to me. So I would put it into two categories. One is what I would just call clearly nefarious, right? There's Elon Musk and the rich guys that he is friends with want to shut down certain government functions because they are annoying to them, right? So they are shutting down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Today they dismissed 5 or 6 active lawsuits that the CFPB had brought against financial firms that were scamming people. These are cases that they spent years documenting, putting together the evidence, filed them in court. They just got dismissed, and those cases can't be brought again. And so, companies like Capital One and big mortgage companies like Rocket Mortgage are off the hook for things that were documented in these court filings where they were scamming people. And Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg had both called out the CFPB because the CFPB had tried to stop them, or at least make sure that they were doing things properly as they were trying to enter the financial services space. Facebook wanted to do payments through its network. Musk wants to do payments through Twitter and X. The CFPB oversees that. So by defanging this agency, they're basically letting undermining the watchdog that would stop them from engaging in potential consumer abuses. So that's category one. Category two is just unthinking across the board cuts based on, I would say, disdain for government employees, right? So they just said, go ahead and fire anybody who's a probationary employee, right? That's a category of government worker. Some of those folks, when you first are hired into the government, you spend about a year as a probationary employee. So it basically means all the people who are newly hired into government. But the thing that they didn't realize is that if you are recently promoted to a new position, you also are in a probationary period. So it also meant that they fired people who had been promoted for doing a good job recently and had the misfortune of having.
So you could have been there for 14 years, been doing such a good job that you were promoted into position, but because that automatically categorized you as a probationary employee, you were right on the chopping block without even any consideration, because that was one of the first wave of people that got bounced out.
And I would say, I think the thing that they didn't fully realize which is funny because I think anybody who spent 5 minutes looking at how the government works and who federal workers are would realize this, is that more than 30% of federal employees are veterans. There are clear preferences in hiring for veterans, and a lot of people leave military service and go work in the government. They work at the FAA if they work, previously worked at the Air Force, or they go work at the VA health system to provide care to fellow veterans or so on. And so a hugely disproportionate number of the people who have been fired are veterans. And I think that they're just starting to realize that, and they're scrambling to start to bring those folks back. I just make one last point to build on what Tony was saying. This DOGE stuff is all very, very bad for the country. And I think that some of this damage, I think, will be very hard to reverse in the future. But I think one very small silver lining to all of this is that all of the stories that are coming about the types of workers that are being fired, I think is educating a lot of the public about what the federal government does.
Yeah,
So
it is surprising. Yeah.
And so people are like, oh, yeah, that's right. They inspect the food to make sure that I don't get salmonella.
All that invisible things that
Right.
you don't see once they're gone, or, there's a lot of agencies that I personally had never heard of. And then once I heard describe what they were actually doing, that was an educational part for me, because it broadens your understanding of what the federal government actually does. And Lucy, as the Lever has been covering DOGE, talk a little bit about that. What have been talk about some of the stories that we've been posting.
For sure. I mean, just echoing Tony and Bharat, like it's so disappointing to see this conservative attack on federal workers and public servants. Both my parents are public school teachers. They obviously have really instilled in me a respect for public service. But I think it's obviously disappointing, and it has so many unforeseen consequences. Like just today, we were reporting on how major cuts to the fire service, to the National Forest Service, is actually just quite literally laying the tinder for what could be even bigger forest fires across the West this year. Because people who were seasonal or probationary workers were fired, obviously, like at will. And now won't be able to do trail maintenance and forest maintenance and any sort of prevention efforts. It's the same things even that Trump was, just bashing Western states and specifically California for not doing land management, but now they're unable to. So that was just today. But I think there's also so many examples of Elon Musk using DOGE and his position within the government to really advance his own personal interests. When just weeks into Trump's term, Trump, it's so hard to remember now, but likely illegally fired more than a dozen inspectors general. And we reported that half of those inspectors generals had been involved in cases specifically looking and overseeing against Musk's many companies. Musk's companies have billions of dollars in contracts with the federal government, and in fact have only been expanding them. Since Trump was inaugurated, Musk's companies have been averaging about $2 million a day in additional contracts with the federal government. The latest one this week was the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, which Musk, easy to confuse them, which Musk basically looked into the FAA's budget, examined its contracts with Verizon, in which it manages its airspace monitoring networks, and has moved to cut Verizon's $2.8 billion contract and switch it to Starlink. There are just so many examples of blatant personal enrichment. And then I think just as concerning is this real push towards cutting the federal workforce in a much longer conservative campaign to undermine the public's trust in government. The federal workforce is like less than 1% of the federal budget. It's drops in the bucket. But when they're not there, the government doesn't work. And what happens when the government doesn't work is the public loses its trust and actually encourages the federal government to hire private contractors instead, which generally cost the government more and aren't aligned with the same public interests that we would hope federal workers are. So That's some of our reporting. But
And Lucy, I think that's great. And spot on. And I would just add a couple of things. I think the personal enrichment and how, Elon Musk, Trump, like to Bharat's point about the CFPB and its ability to regulate financial tech, like Trump Media was also looking to get into the payments. So the fact that they're dismantling the CFPB and how that will personally benefit the people that are doing the dismantling. But the second piece, we did a lot of work on Project 2025 going last year, just looking at the agenda that if Trump were to get in, like what that would be, and they're following it to a T. And one of the things that we kept saying was that they want to gut checks and balances, and because there was this belief that Congress would stand up or the courts would stand up, but they're just going and doing a lot of these independent agencies. They're just like USAID, the CFPB, all these acronyms that people might not know what they mean. Like they're just going and consolidating power, so they're having more control. And I think people need to know, what does that mean for me? And we're seeing what that means. It means it's easier for them to put contracts in the ways that's going to line the pockets of their friends or themselves. And it's also easier for them to just take away and raise costs for everyone else. We're going to pay the price for the fact that it's easier for them to go and to make money off of all of this. And I would say, my last point,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Tony.
that the whole idea of DOGE that they're trying to sell is like, we're rooting out waste and fraud, and that we're finding you're going to save all this money. I think in Lucy, to your point, that this is a very small sliver of the budget. But if you look at what was being reported today, that 40% of the contracts that they're canceling or just cutting actually doesn't save the government any money. They're not saving any money. This is all just it's like a disguise to root out and do.
It costs a lot of money to cancel a contract. For anyone that's ever hired anybody or been involved in a complicated project, you cancel a contract, the things that come out of that often cost everybody more. Let's take some questions. We have one from a anonymous. Bharat, it's for you. I didn't know that so many federal workers are veterans. Where did you find this 33% figure? Many Americans support veterans. Can't we use this data to help save the jobs of federal workers?
Yes. So it's if you look at reports from the GAO, so ironically, there is actually an existing agency.
There's one left, the GAO.
That their entire job is to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, it's already exists. It's called the Government Accountability Office. They have lots and lots of good reports, and one of them will tell you about the makeup of the federal workforce, and that 30% figure is there. And that's because a long time ago, Congress put into the law that agencies should give hiring preferences to veterans. So if you're going to hire for a particular job, if one person is a veteran and they're qualified, more often than not, the agency is going to hire that person. And so as a result, the federal workforce tends to be disproportionately veterans. And you're right, it is a pretty powerful advocacy tool, and you're already starting to see reversals. So for example, when they came into office, they immediately put on leave every single employee of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Today, I saw reporting that they tucked tail and said, okay, if you're a veteran, we're going to hire you back. Okay, now that's not going to be everybody, of course, but it's still a decent chunk of the agency. And so I think that they clearly are feeling the pressure about the fact that they've basically come to office and conducted a mass layoff campaign of America's veterans, right? There's probably been no larger effort in recent history to fire veterans than this most recent DOGE effort.
Mm-hmm. And there's already, I think, pushback from Republicans in their districts many of whose constituents, like I think Tony and Bharat said earlier, did not expect this when they were voting to wipe out corruption and fraud in the government. Like I remember just this week, Representative Rich McCormick, who is a representative from Georgia, held a public town hall in his district and was met with boos basically to remove the rein in the megalomaniac in the White House by his constituents. And now he is actually publicly begging Trump to slow his federal worker firing spree, which, if anything, is helpful to know that pressure on your politicians can still work, at least to some extent. But I think it's also a sign that the coalition that they're moving with, and this bedazzled chainsaw hacking that they're taking to the federal service, is not being well received and is already starting to fall apart.
And
I think the key
yeah.
here is to sort of demystify what the federal bureaucracy is. And I think the more people I think the point was made earlier, the more people see who these people are and what they're doing, they're like, this isn't what we're, and the fact that not all federal workers work in the DC area. They're all across the country. So this is impacting the country. It's not just in the Maryland, Virginia, DC area.
And Tony, we had a question from Nancy. Who are the members of DOGE and what is their background?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting to see what they're saying publicly. Like Elon Musk is clearly the face of DOGE until they do a court filing and say that he's actually not an employee of DOGE. He's like a senior advisor to the or something. I don't know. I don't have I mean, I've seen reports that there's a lot of 19 and 20-year-old people that are going around and talking to federal workers that have been in the workforce for 20, like all of their careers, and just telling them, what you did doesn't matter anymore, and like it's time to leave. So I think we've been seeing, I think 60 Minutes did a good look at this, particularly with the CFPB, of like what, how the DOGE employees are. I think every department, it seems to be that they have like a mini DOGE in each department as they're going in. So it's pretty unclear to me. There's not a lot of transparency about how this works, how they're coming to these decisions, and what's going on. Mm-hmm. So, which is obviously a huge red flag.
And some of it, I think, is really concerning, like beyond just the insults of firing all of these experienced workers. There are also really serious security concerns and structural concerns. We had Nathan Tankus, who's an economist, on our podcast last week. And he really specializes in focusing on the Treasury and the virtual infrastructure, which is, just so much online infrastructure that houses Social Security payments, all of the taxpayer information, contracts that we owe, billions, trillions of contracts that we owe to private contractors and to public agencies and to other governments around the world. And he was talking about how a lot of this is maintained by programmers who have been at the Treasury for decades and have built this very specific structure. And now Elon Musk and his young DOGE coders, programmers, hackers are trying to basically rewrite those programs, which could be disastrous. That's people's private information, their Social Security payments. If that program goes down, I mean, Nathan Tankus literally warned it could crash the global economy. So very, very serious concerns about who is given clearance here.
Okay, so we're about halfway through our event. Thank you, everyone who's been leaving questions. And if you're just joining us, I'm Jared. I'm a producer at The Lever, here with Lucy Dean Stockton, news editor. And we have Tony Carrk from Accountable and Bharat Ramamurti here to explain and sort of see what they're seeing as people who've watched Washington and know a lot about how the insides of these efforts work. And let's talk a little bit about the tax bill, because while everyone's been busy paying attention to DOGE and Elon Musk theatrics, the major tax bill, the legislation that Trump basically campaigned on. He wants to massively cut taxes for workers and small businesses. He talked about having no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits. That was, if you ask Trump voters today, what they remember those statements. And there's a lot of pressure coming down on Congress to pass those policies as soon as possible. But let's talk a little bit about what's actually in the latest tax resolutions passed by the House, and unwind a little bit about that to hear, are these actual benefits, tax breaks that are going to go to a lot of people that voted for Trump? Maybe Bharat, you help us with this.
So I need to get wonky for a second because it goes to the heart of your question. What Republicans are doing is working through a somewhat complicated process called the reconciliation process. And what that allows them to do, just so that people understand, is pass this bill ultimately with a majority in the House and 50 votes in the Senate. And folks will realize that that's important because you'll remember that a lot of other things get filibustered in the Senate and you end up needing 60 votes in the Senate, which means you need to do it typically in a bipartisan way. But this specific procedure lets them do it without getting 60 votes in the Senate. Now, we did it during the Biden administration to pass the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's something that both parties have done. But the way that this process works is that it's two steps. First, you have to pass a resolution, a budget resolution that says, we're going to do this bill, and here are the general outlines of what the bill looks like. It's going to add this much to the deficit. It's going to add this. It's going to do this much in tax revenue reduction. It's going to do this much in spending reductions. And so they have to pass that resolution and get it signed.
It's kind of like a blueprint for
Exactly.
what the ultimate legislation will look like.
And then they have to go back and fill in the details and said, okay, so you said we have to cut $2 trillion in spending. Now we're going to figure out the way that we're going to do that is by cutting this specific program and that specific program. So right now they're on stage one of that. So what the House did this past week was pass that resolution. And those top line numbers we're going to do a total of $4.5 trillion in tax cuts and revenue reduction. And we're going to do about $2 trillion in spending cuts and spending savings. So, and then add the remainder $2.5 trillion that's left over goes to the deficit. Okay, so that's the outline of their bill. Now, what they have also done to get even more wonky is that they assign parts of that to different committees in the House. And so by assigning certain parts of it to certain committees, you can start to fill in the gaps about what types of things they're going to cut. So for example, they said to one committee, you have to find $880 billion in spending reductions. Now, the major thing that committee oversees is the Medicaid program. Okay, so when you tell that committee you have to cut $880 billion, that's basically saying you're going to cut Medicaid. Now, Republicans are going around and saying, like, no, we didn't technically say we're going to cut Medicaid. But again, if you can do mathematics, you can figure out that this is an instruction to cut Medicaid. So,
and that the way that they're structuring that, because I'm not aware, is that a typical way that they would assign to committees? They say, like,
yeah,
here's your task, here's your homework, go and find.
That's typical.
This. Okay.
Yeah, so that's the way that this special reconciliation process works. You send these instructions to committees. Now, if the committee doesn't meet its obligation under that bill, the whole thing falls apart, right? Because if you don't create a bill that matches what you did in that resolution that passed, you can't use this process. Right. So this first step is very important because it basically says we have to meet all of these criteria, otherwise we can't pass this bill. So the point of all of this is to say, if you look carefully at the magnitude of the tax cuts and the spending cuts they're talking about, and you look at the breakdown of which committees got those assignments, it's very clear that what they're going to do is a massive cut to the Medicaid program to offset part of the cost of massive tax cuts. Now, you said, you rightly pointed out that Trump campaigned on all of these kind of middle-class seeming tax cuts. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits. The $4.5 trillion in tax cuts that I mentioned before that they've allocated here, that is purely the cost of extending the expiring provisions. It doesn't include any of those other tax cuts. And so the way I read this resolution is they're just going to extend all the stuff that was going to expiring, which I remember, as I said before, is all slanted towards the very rich. They're not going to be able to fit in any of the no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security stuff. And they're going to pay for part of it by taking a hammer to the Medicaid program. That again, that's just if you piece together the pieces of this resolution and you have some knowledge about how this process works, that's really what this budget resolution means.
So at the end of this process, the no taxes on tips, all of those things that Trump campaigned on, those are going to get left out in the cold, most likely, because it's already going to be nearly impossible for them to find the money to pass the current tax cuts.
Exactly. Or they're going to have to sacrifice and say, we're not going to extend some of these previous expiring provisions. I just don't think that they're going to do that because, the wealthy donors and supporters of the Republican Party, they want these tax cuts to be extended because remember, it was a huge benefit for them. Just to give you some context, under this, by extending these expiring tax cuts, the average family that makes $1 million a year will get a $70,000 annual tax break. Right? So this is a big deal for those types of folks. And if you make $10 million, you can imagine what that tax cut is worth to you, right? So it's big money for them, and I just don't have a hard time seeing them leaving that on the table.
Yeah, I would say, I think, this process is going to be long. It's got a lot of competing interests. It's going to be complicated. I think you have to take them at their word of like, who are they going to go to the mat for? And Bharat's exactly right. They're going to go to the mat for the wealthy and their big donors. And this is going to be a giant redistribution of income from the working class to the rich. It's Medicaid is like the biggest one. And I think it's obviously that's healthcare for low-income people. It's also Medicaid covers a lot of seniors in long-term care. But also they're looking to cut some food assistance, like the SNAP program. So food stamps, it's like programs that people rely on. And we're going to see the same old tropes about like these are lazy people that don't deserve the benefits they get, where like most of the people that are on Medicaid are actually working. They have a job. It's just a job that doesn't either offer benefits or offer good benefits. And there's people that need food assistance just to help like feed their kids. I mean, I think this whole notion and this whole debate that we're gonna be having over the course of the year is really going to be a debate about values and who are you fighting for. And I think that is why it's really important to just call out what they're trying to do, because they're going to mask it in, we don't want to raise taxes on working people. They're going to say other things, this isn't about debt reduction. They're adding to the debt. Trump is out there making promises about everything. We're not, luckily in this process, you can't touch Social Security, like you just can't in the reconciliation process, but he's out there saying like, we're not going to touch Social Security. We're not going to touch Medicare. Now he's saying we're not going to touch Medicaid. We're not, all of these things can't be true at once. Something's got to give. And the thing that's going to give is benefits for working people, because what they're going to protect at all costs is making sure that the benefits go to their billionaire donors.
And before we move on, you mentioned who are they going to go to the mat for when it actually comes down to it, when all these pressures come to bear, who will they go to the mat for? They're the wealthiest donors, the wealthiest 1%, the wealthiest 0.01%. And why? Like, why? What are the incentives in place, especially for Republicans? Some are ideological, but some of these cuts and passing a bill like this would be a lot easier for them politically if they didn't have to give such big tax breaks, if they were able to give a little bit or throw in things that would give better tax incentives or tax breaks to their constituents. Why are they going to go to the mat?
I think there is obviously an ideological aspect to this. I think but what is interesting, there is a debate that's going on the right. If you listen to, between like Steve Bannon has actually articulated this a little bit more about like, a lot of MAGA voters are on Medicaid, and that this budget process is taking the knife to their benefits. So why are they doing that? Like it is a matter. It's like like the coalition and the old ideology are still there's kind of a turmoil that's going on in there, but that has just usually been their like North Star about the answer to everything, it seems like, for Republican governance is cut taxes. We're just going to cut taxes, and it's usually cut taxes for the rich. So I think that is one of the reasons why, but we also why I think that they're going to go to the mat for them, because let's take a whole government look here. What are they trying to do? It's not just isolation in the tax fight. This goes back to our DOGE conversation about what they're trying to do about dismantling government. It's like they're taking the regulation and the oversight that's protecting people from corporate greed, from predatory practices. They want it to allow the big corporations to do whatever they want, charge whatever they want. That means your costs go up, that it doesn't do anything for your day-to-day life. And I think that is just their approach to governance. And it's from everything. It's from the regulatory side, it's from the tax side. I think there's a lot of evidence to show that that is a failed ideology. Like, tax cuts do not pay for themselves. Cutting taxes for the rich does not bring economic growth and jobs and everything that they've created. There's actually a model that works where you can have broad-based shared prosperity, where you lift everyone up and bring better wages, lower prices. But that's just not the model that they choose to follow.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And I think also, I mean, when you look at the budget, we keep returning to Medicaid, and I know there are so many cuts, which like we'll definitely talk about, but it is like the biggest cuts have been demanded of it, $880 billion over any other area. And it's like, it's so devastating. Like I think it's like 37% of people under 19 have Medicaid health insurance. I mean, that is like America's children are on Medicaid and like will lose their health insurance. It's just like really, really devastating to see. And at the same time, there are these decreases in mandatory spending in like Medicaid, but also in education, workforce, agriculture. There's also simultaneously increases in mandatory spending for armed services, Homeland Security, and the judiciary. And it's like Homeland Security is probably going to go towards more aggressive prosecution of immigrants. Armed services always gets more money in every budget. So I think it's like important also to see, even in the budget, like while they're demanding these big cuts and giving tax cuts that beget them, they're still pursuing these other priorities.
And before we move on, here's a question about Medicaid from Hillary and Mary. If these cuts go through, how soon will Medicaid stop functioning? Do you think they will kill Medicare and Social Security? Let's start with the Medicaid question. 880 billion is their homework assignment to cut. Of course, that bill hasn't been passed yet. It's just a resolution. But what would that do to the Medicaid system? Is it, will it stop functioning for most people?
Yeah, I mean, it's already stretched really thin. I would just say, the way that the Medicaid program works is that the federal government contributes a portion of the money, and then the states contribute another portion of the money. So if you think about it, if the federal government pulls back a huge amount, $880 billion, the states are going to say there's going to be pressure on the states to either fill in some of that gap, which means that they're going to have to cut from other programs to shift money over to Medicaid, or they're just going to they're going to cut back on coverage, and people are going to lose coverage. Those are really the only two options that are available out there. And as Tony said, Medicaid covers a lot of things that people don't necessarily think about. Yes, it covers insurance for low-income people. It covers a lot of children, as Lucy noted. It covers a lot of people with disabilities, long-term disabilities, people with, who need the assistance of another adult. It covers a huge percentage of long-term care, so nursing home care in the United States. If you have a loved one in a nursing home, odds are that nursing home exists because of the Medicaid program, and without it, it would not be able to function. So you would probably see a massive long-term care crisis in America if you see cuts at this scale. So, I think what Republicans are hoping is that if they cut at the federal level, maybe the states will just figure out a way of solving the problem for them. But it just seems very, very unlikely because you're either going to have to, it's just not a sum of money that states are going to be able to produce given the budgets that they have. And given the fact that states have balanced budget requirements, they can't just go out and borrow a bunch of money. They actually have to have balanced budgets each year. So, yeah, go ahead.
And so this process of drafting this new federal budget with the cuts and the cuts to spending and the tax breaks, it's sort of in the early stages still, and seems like it could last through the summer. I know Trump would probably like it earlier, but it from what I've understood, it could go into that. Now, as this develops, what should our audience and listeners out there be watching for and keep an eye on as they negotiate this? What stages should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, I can go first, then Tony, you should jump in. Like I said, this is a complicated process, and so far you have stage one, which is that the House has passed its resolution. Now, the next step is that the Senate has to pass a resolution, and the two have to be the same, right, before it can be signed by the president. So the Senate, it seems to have, the Republicans in the Senate seem to have different ideas about what this resolution looks like. So in the first instance, there's going to be a fight between Republicans in the Senate and the House about the contours of this resolution, and they're going to have to hash that out. Now, you've heard from a small handful of Senate Republicans saying, I'm really uncomfortable cutting Medicaid. Susan Collins from Maine has said that. Josh Hawley from Missouri has said that. My guess is that they will figure out a way of kind of smoothing over those differences. And you're already starting to see it. I saw Speaker Johnson on TV saying, I don't want to take Medicaid away from a single mom, 19-year-old single mom. But if there's a 25-year-old guy on the couch who's been getting Medicaid, we want to get him off his couch and get him into the workplace. So to me, what that means is that they're going to do a lot of stuff they're going to impose work requirements that will be really difficult for people to document that they're meeting the requirements. So they'll end up losing coverage, not because they're not working or not because they're not doing a good enough job trying to find a job, but because the paperwork is so complicated. Yep. The result will be a cut, but they'll just say, oh, it was a work requirement. We didn't kick anybody off of Medicare, right? They'll say, oh, we're cutting down on fraud, but it turns out that a lot of that fraud is because you have understaffed state offices that are supposed to administer the Medicaid program. They can't, again, administer all the right paperwork. So there's the Senate-House tension that has to be resolved in the first instance. Then the next thing is that if and when they do agree, they're going to have to go fill in the details, like I talked about. Okay, you have to cut $880 billion. How are you going to do that? Okay, what does your $4.5 trillion in tax cuts actually look like? That's going to be a whole nother fight between the House and the Senate, because the people on both sides are going to have vastly different priorities for how to use that money, especially on the tax cut side. So if I were to guess, this is going to stretch way into the summer, potentially towards the end of the year. So there'll be an opportunity to push. And now I know at times it can feel hopeless and just say, what are we supposed to do right now? Republicans control the House and the Senate. They seem impervious to public opinion on these issues. I would just say, I remember in 2017 when Republicans won the House and the Senate and the White House, there was an assumption that meant that the Affordable Care Act was dead. That was the top priority of the Republican Party was repealing the Affordable Care Act. And they failed ultimately, right, by one vote in the Senate. And it was because there was a ton of public pressure throughout that entire process, in part because of Medicaid. A lot of it was because of resistance to cutting Medicaid. That derailed it just enough to stop it from getting the necessary number of votes. So I would just say, get out there, have stories about what cutting Medicaid would mean for people, explain how these tax cuts are distributed and how it's really a huge giveaway to the very, very rich. That's wildly unpopular across the board. And, hopefully you can create enough pressure over time that you peel off enough of these Republicans to say, I don't want to sign up for this. This is like a political death sentence for me. Let's pass something else.
Yeah, I know we've been talking a lot about Medicaid, but I think it's like hugely important. And the reason is like, this is how they're going to pay for, more CEO, like billionaire CEO, billionaire donor tax cuts. And to Bharat's point about the Affordable Care Act, like one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did and why there was such coverage expansion is it expanded Medicaid. If states signed up and expanded Medicaid, the federal government kicked in some more funding to cover more people, which has been hugely popular in even like very conservative states. And one of the things that is, if they try to get rid of that, that could be another way that they cut, that they're just getting rid of the enhanced Medicaid, so the Medicaid expansion. There are a dozen, I don't quote me on that, but states that have like trigger laws that if the federal government reduces that portion, that they're going to pull back as well, which would mean, millions of people losing coverage that way. It's also a huge issue for rural hospitals. Like a lot of like hospitals in rural areas like need the Medicaid money to stay open and to get patient care. You have people in rural areas that's probably the only place that they can get care within like an okay driving distance. So I think the reason that we talk about Medicaid so much is that it is such a lifeline for folks, but it's also a program that touches a lot of different constituencies that are vital in different parts of the country.
And Lucy, do you have anything to add before we jump into some Q&A for our last 10 minutes? As far as what is the lever looking at, what have you seen come through that you're watching for as this fight goes on?
I mean, we're definitely interested in, I think, elements of privatization, especially that come from this, which is just like as these things are cut, I'm wondering what will step in and replace them. But yeah, I think echoing everything Tony and Bharat said, like Medicaid is a really huge and serious issue, and it is actually, I mean, it becomes this bashing talking point for conservatives, but in many districts, in many Republican districts, a huge amount of their constituents are on Medicaid, and so it's like I think that might be the only reason why they go to bat for it. And it's also Medicaid has seen so much turbulence in the last few years, really since the pandemic. Part of what made Biden's rating so popular in his first 2 years was actually like the expansion of Medicaid. And as the Medicaid unwinding hit, it really changed the political tides. Medicaid unwinding was a disaster for millions of Americans. And because of the unique funding structure of Medicaid, states were, of course, eager to kick people off and disenroll them. So I think it will be really troubling to see that as it affects working people. Something else that I am interested in looking at is the role of artificial intelligence in all of these cuts. And I don't really think there's time to go into that yet, but we've just reported on that as well last week about the role of algorithms in all of these places. And I think in Medicaid especially, algorithms, AI and algorithmic mechanisms have already been implemented to kick people off Medicaid and deny their care. So there are really interesting and troubling reporting
and the
channels there.
And the way that they're framing it, right, especially with Elon Musk and Doge, we can go in and fire all these, lazy humans that have been doing these jobs and cut costs and just replace it and get so much efficiency with artificial intelligence. And the next question is that I know that, we're going to be looking at, our reporters are going to be watching very closely, is who's getting those contracts? What AI models are getting the benefits from that? What of the lineup of Silicon Valley CEOs that we had at Trump's inauguration will be in line to be the beneficiaries of that?
Yeah. And I think that ties actually really well back into the tax bill, which is just that those tech CEOs in the front row at the inauguration are first in line to reap these enormous, enormous tax breaks. They got great deals in the 2017 tax bill, and I think they're gunning for the same thing again. So,
all
yeah.
right, let's do some questions. We have one from Okay, wait, let me see. We have one question, and actually, Tony and Bharat, you might be able just to give a quick tip on this. How do you find out who is on what committee
In
I
Congress?
actually
in Congress? I'm
I
assuming.
actually answered that one in the chat with a link that you can go to if you turn to the Q&A on the list of representatives, sorry, on the House of Representatives list, they have a list of all the committees, and you click to those specific committees, and then they list the members. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to note that it was already there for resource.
We haven't talked at all yet about how the judiciary is involved with this fight, but um, with so many lawsuits going through the federal courts, we have a question from Tom Calicaro. Do you think SCOTUS will overrule the federal judges and allow Trump to overreach his powers limited by the Constitution? That's the big question that will have to get answered, right?
Well, I would say, like, if you look at the history of the court, just the recent history, one of the things that we do at Accountable is obviously looking at the courts and showing how they've been captured by big corporate interests and like the extreme conservatives. And I think if you look at the immunity ruling that just came down last year, and also the overturning of decades-long precedent, not just the overturning of Roe, but overturning of what's called the Chevron deference, whereas that which makes it easier for corporations to working through Congress to write their own rules. Before, what the Chevron deference meant was that if there was some ambiguity or if Congress didn't spell out specifically how an industry was going to be regulated, it deferred to the experts in the federal workforce. So what they're doing right now is they're gutting the federal workforce, and they're also making it easier. They're saying Congress should regulate in that sense, but Congress has always been deferring, and that just makes it easier for special interests to come in and write their own rules. So that has been how the Supreme Court has been favoring as of late. So I guess we'll see what happens this year. There have been some good news that are coming out of the courts at the district level, like that you were mentioning, that's been really stopping some of these egregious acts that the Trump administration is trying to pursue. I guess the question is like, I think this is important of why we should be making sure that we're looking at the courts and the conflicts of interest that are going on between, with our justices. It's a very opaque, there's not a lot of financial transparency there. There's also not an enforceable judicial code of ethics. That's one of the things that we've been working on. Just how do we make sure that the highest court in the land has the highest ethical standards? I think that's also an area that we've been working on as well.
And along with that, Tony, I know Accountable has a really great project on your site, Accountable US, that I was looking at a lot last year, the section on monitoring influence, focusing on Leonard Leo, but that will help you connect the dots with the particular type of judges that are in the federal judiciary now, and especially at the Supreme Court, and give a sense of what we're dealing with on that front. We have a question. What can we do to fight this? Are there any organizations that we can get involved with that are fighting this? Accountable US being one of them. Do you have any recommendations? Who can folks connect with, get on newsletters? Do you have any that you follow in particular?
Well, I think what we're seeing, there are different types of organizations. So for example, we're like a research communications organization. There are a lot of groups like Move On and others that have members at the grassroots that are about organizing, like Indivisible and others. I think those are good areas ways to get involved as well. And there's just I would just also look to your member, or if you're in it, or look to some of the members that you're seeing out that are really taking a stand, and who are the groups that are with them. I know our friends in labor, particularly how this is impacting workers. They're going to be taking a stand and fighting on behalf of workers. That's a place that can be involved as well. So there's a lot of people that are getting involved I guess it's a matter of how do you want to get involved. Do you want to get involved more at the grassroots, like going to a town hall, doing some of, helping with some events, or if there's other ways, just sharing information with your friends on, on social media, just so people are armed with the facts to make sure that they can get the message out.
That's right. Any other tips come to mind, Lucy or Bharat? About good organization.
I definitely recommend everyone gets a subscription to The Lever. I think in addition to The Lever, there are so many great news outlets that I think are really cropping up doing independent investigative work, which is great to see. The American Prospect, Drop Site, 404 Media, many independent orgs that are willing to also depart with, I think, corporate media, and a lot of the ways that it, I think, failed during the last election. And I agree. I think putting pressure on local politicians is a great way to make a difference, particularly if you are, platforming and challenging them. I would say, like, of course, run for office in local areas, though I myself have never done it, and I know it's very hard. But I think all of those things, and increasingly, I've really felt a lot of value in creating like mutualist organizations. So whether that's like joining like a grocery cooperative or doing tenant organizing where you live. I'm in New York City, and so there's a lot of, there is a lot happening in our local politics, of course, for anyone who knows about Mayor Eric Adams. But I think all of those things are really meaningful. And I think, I turned to look at Master Plan, the investigative podcast that we put out last year. It told basically a 50-year story of corruption, or the plot to really legalize corruption in the United States. And I think it was obviously kind of disturbing to see how much of it
along with that, Lucy,
was strategic.
There is some news.
Yeah.
We are currently, I don't know if we've actually publicly announced this yet, but we are working on a book version of the Master Plan podcast. So we hope that we can start releasing information about that, and you can start doing pre-orders here in a few weeks, because we're trying to get that out the door. That's been my big task for the last 3 months, burying my head in that. And then also stay tuned to the Lever Time podcast feed, because we have producers working on a smaller but still in-depth series about the history of taxes in America and how we got to this particular point. And I think that type of history will be very informative. Well, that is all the time we have for tonight. Lucy, thank you so much for helping put this together. And thanks to Tony Carrk from Accountable, and Bharat Ramamurti for joining us. And again, you can follow Accountable by going to their website, accountable.us. I recommend signing up for their newsletter. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we hope you found this discussion valuable. And we'll see you next time. Have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.